The big meeting room on the spaceship Meridian was full of people from 3 different planets. They were all trying to make friends and trade deals, but they had a big problem. The computer that helped them talk to each other wasn't working very well. Dr. Sarah Chin stood at the back of the room. She was supposed to check if the computer was translating things right, but she found something else more interesting. She watched how people got confused when they tried to share ideas that didn't exist in other languages. The way Kithon people think about time cannot be put into normal space language, said the computer in its flat voice. This showed another time when the machine couldn't help different species understand each other. Sarah watched Lyrith, a young woman from the Kithon planet. She was trying hard to explain something that made perfect sense to her people but had no words in any other language. The patterns on Lyrith's skin started glowing brighter when she got upset. She kept trying different ways to share her idea, but it kept getting lost. Sarah remembered that the Kithon people were refugees. Their home planet had been destroyed 300 years ago. Now they lived scattered across the galaxy in small groups. Most of them had slowly forgotten their own culture and language. Today's Kithon people spoke normal space language as their main way to talk. Only the oldest people still remembered pieces of their ancestors' words. Maybe we can talk about this later when the computer works better, said Ambassador Torres, trying to be nice. But Sarah could see that Lyrith looked sad. Another piece of Kithon culture was being pushed aside because it couldn't be translated. When the meeting ended and everyone went to their rooms, Sarah walked over to Lyrith. The young woman was still sitting at the table, looking at notes written in her people's flowing letters. Hard meeting? Sarah asked gently. Lyrith looked up. Her big dark eyes looked tired in a way that went deeper than just being sleepy. Every meeting is hard, Dr. Chin. There are ideas that are central to how Kithon people think that just can't be said in any other language. Every time we fail to translate something, it feels like we're losing another piece of who we used to be. Sarah looked at the notes on Lyrith's tablet. She recognized some of the letters from her early studies of Kithon writing. You write in the old style, Sarah said. Not very well, Lyrith said with a sad smile. I learned bits and pieces from my grandmother before she died, but there are so few people left who can speak it. Most of us who were born away from our home planet can barely have simple conversations in our ancestors' language. This gave Sarah an idea. It was more than just being curious about languages, it was a professional challenge. Would you want to work with me on a project to save your language? I study dead languages and bring them back to life. I've been looking at old Kithon messages from before your people were scattered. Lyrith's skin patterns got brighter with sudden interest. You've studied our old records? But those files are incomplete and not very reliable for research. Not reliable for history research, maybe, Sarah agreed, but very valuable for language detective work. I can use pattern recognition, grammar analysis, and sound rebuilding. There's enough information to rebuild big parts of classical Kithon if we approach it the right way. Over the next few days, Sarah threw herself into the project with energy that surprised even her co-workers. She worked late into the ship's night hours, studying thousands of hours of old Kithon communications. She compared vocabulary patterns with grammar structures and sound changes that painted a picture of a language much more complex than what refugee Kithon people spoke today. The big discovery came when Sarah realized that classical Kithon wasn't just different vocabulary. It was a completely different way of organizing thoughts. Ideas about time, identity, and connection to place were built into the grammar in ways that shaped how speakers understood basic parts of existence. Dr. Chen, Lyrith said during one of their evening work sessions, what you're trying to do, even if you succeed in rebuilding the language, who would speak it? My people have adapted to new worlds and new ways of thinking. Maybe it's better to let the old language rest with our lost home world." Sarah looked up from her language analysis, struck by the giving-up tone in the younger woman's voice. "Language isn't just communication, Lyrith. It's identity, it's memory. It's a way of keeping not just words, but entire ways of understanding the universe." She pointed to her rebuilding work where patterns of meaning were starting to emerge from centuries-old pieces. "Your ancestors didn't just speak differently. They thought differently. They had concepts and insights that could make Kidhan culture richer, and all galaxy civilization too." The moment of truth came 3 weeks later during another diplomatic session where cultural exchange had once again stopped because of translation problems. Sarah had spent the previous night finishing her rebuilding of key philosophical terms. As she watched Lyra struggle to explain the Kidhan concept of Valaner, a word that meant something like the emotional connection between consciousness and the cosmos, she made a decision that would change everything. Standing up from her observer position, Sarah spoke directly to Lyrith in carefully rebuilt classical Kidhan, Madath Castiveran while Lyrith Nastranval Vina the Morden Talavi. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Lyrith's entire body went stiff, her glowing patterns flaring with shock and disbelief. The other people in the meeting turned to stare as the universal translator struggled to process the old dialect, producing only broken pieces of Sarah's meaning. "Who are you?" Lyrith whispered in Standard Galactic, her voice shaking with emotion Sarah couldn't begin to understand. "How do you know those words? How do you speak like the voices from the deep archives, like the ancestors themselves?" Sarah realized she had just crossed a line she hadn't fully understood existed. By speaking classical Kidhan with skill no living member of that species had, she had awakened something in Lyrith that went far beyond language curiosity. She had touched cultural memories that had been buried but not lost, connections to a heritage that survived despite centuries of exile and change. "I've been studying your people's language heritage," Sarah said softly, switching back to Standard Galactic as the room remained frozen in attentive silence. "Working to rebuild what was scattered but not destroyed." Lyrith's eyes filled with tears that caught the conference room's lights like stars. "You made me remember," she said, her voice barely audible. "Words my grandmother sang to me as a child, meanings I felt but could never express. You made me remember who we were before we became refugees." The deep impact of that moment spread through both the immediate diplomatic gathering and Sarah's understanding of what her academic work truly meant. She hadn't just rebuilt a language, she had recovered a piece of cultural soul that an entire people thought they had lost forever. The aftermath of Sarah's language revelation changed the diplomatic mission in ways no one had expected. Within hours of her spontaneous demonstration of classical Kidhan fluency, word had spread throughout the scattered refugee communities across 3 star systems. Elderly Kidhan who had kept fragments of their ancestral language began contacting the Meridian, eager to contribute their knowledge to what they saw as a miraculous resurrection of their cultural heritage. "Dr. Chen," Lyrith said during their first private conversation after the diplomatic incident, her bioluminescent patterns still flickering with residual emotional intensity, "you don't understand what you've accomplished. For 3 centuries, my people have been slowly forgetting who we were. Each generation speaks less of the old tongue, remembers fewer of the old stories." Sarah nodded, beginning to understand the profound implications of her academic project. "But you've adapted, survived, built new communities. Isn't that more important than keeping ancient language alive?" Lyrith was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns in the air that Sarah recognized as classical Kidhan gesture language, a form of communication that had been documented but which she'd never seen performed by a living person. "We survived," Lyrith agreed finally. "But we've also been dying in ways that have nothing to do with physical existence." When you spoke those words yesterday, I remembered dreams I used to have as a child. Dreams where I understood songs that made no sense when I woke up, where I knew the meanings of words that don't exist in standard galactic. She looked directly at Sarah with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. You gave me back a part of myself I didn't even realize was missing. Their collaboration deepened as other Kithan survivors began contributing to the language rebuilding project. Elder refugees sent audio recordings of half-remembered songs, fragments of poetry, and ritual phrases that had been kept through oral tradition but had lost much of their original context and meaning. Listen to this, Sarah said during one of their evening work sessions, playing a recording that had arrived from a Kithan settlement in the Vega system. Elder Kester remembers a blessing that was spoken at coming-of-age ceremonies, but she's not sure about the grammar structure of the final verse. As the elderly Kithan's voice filled Sarah's workshop with sounds that had not been heard in their proper context for generations, Lyritha's reaction was immediate and profound. Her skin patterns brightened with recognition, and she began speaking along with the recording, supplying words that Elder Kester had forgotten and correcting pronunciations that had drifted during centuries of disuse. "How do you know those words?" Sarah asked with fascination. "You said you only learned fragments from your grandmother." "I did only learn fragments," Lyrith replied, her voice filled with wonder. "But hearing the language spoken properly, the way you've rebuilt it, seems to unlock memories I didn't know I had. As if the knowledge was always there, waiting for the right key." Their work together revealed layer after layer of cultural complexity that had been hidden by language barriers. Classical Kithan contained concepts for which no equivalent existed in any other known tongue, ways of understanding the relationship between consciousness and time, expressions for emotional states that required paragraphs of explanation in standard galactic, and philosophical frameworks that shaped entire approaches to ethics and interpersonal relationships. "Your people don't just think differently," Sarah observed after spending weeks immersed in rebuilt Kithan texts. "You experience reality differently. The language shapes perception in ways that create entirely unique insights. Which is why losing it has been so devastating," Lyrith explained. "We haven't just lost words, we've lost ways of understanding existence that took thousands of years to develop." But their project also faced opposition from unexpected quarters. During a video conference with the Meridian's mission directors, Dr. Harrison Webb expressed concerns that had been raised by several board members. "Dr. Chen, while your language work is undoubtedly impressive from an academic standpoint, some of us question the wisdom of encouraging refugee populations to focus on extinct cultural practices rather than successful integration with contemporary galactic society." Sarah felt her professional composure slip slightly. "Extinct cultural practices, Dr. Webb? We're talking about preserving unique philosophical and language traditions that could benefit all civilizations." "Theoretical benefits," Webb corrected. "Meanwhile, you're encouraging populations that have successfully adapted to modern life to invest time and emotional energy in rebuilding a past that no longer exists." Lyrith, who had been listening to the conversation with increasing agitation, finally spoke up. "Dr. Webb, with respect, successful adaptation and cultural preservation are not mutually exclusive. Remembering who we were doesn't prevent us from contributing to who we're becoming." Her response sparked a broader debate within both human and Kithan communities. Some argued that Sarah's work represented valuable cultural archaeology that could enrich galactic civilization. Others contended that encouraging displaced populations to focus on lost heritage might hinder their integration and adaptation to contemporary realities. The controversy reached a turning point when Sarah and Lyrith made a discovery that changed the entire context of their work. Deep within the rebuilt classical texts, they found detailed descriptions of scientific principles and technological approaches that had been lost with the Kithan homeworld, knowledge that could have practical applications for contemporary engineering and medical research. This isn't just cultural preservation, Sarah realized as she studied translations of ancient Kithan scientific treatises. This is technological archaeology. Your ancestors encoded advanced knowledge in their language in ways that could only be understood by speakers fluent in the classical forms. Lyrith nodded, her excitement matching Sarah's. The language wasn't just a communication tool. It was a storage medium for cultural and scientific knowledge. By rebuilding it, we're not just preserving the past. We're recovering innovations that could benefit the present. Their discovery transformed the debate about language preservation. Suddenly, Sarah's project was viewed not as nostalgic academic exercise, but as practical recovery of lost technologies and scientific insights that could have immediate applications across multiple species. But for Sarah and Lyrith, the most significant transformation was personal. Through their collaborative work, they had built a friendship that transcended species barriers while simultaneously deepening Lyrith's connection to her own cultural heritage. Sarah, Lyrith said one evening as they worked on translating a particularly complex philosophical text, "I want you to know that you've given me something I thought was impossible. The ability to be both who I am and who my people were. I don't have to choose between honoring my ancestors and building a future." Sarah smiled, realizing that their project had become something far more significant than either of them had initially envisioned. They weren't just rebuilding a language. They were proving that cultural preservation and progress could enhance each other, creating richer possibilities for all civilizations willing to invest in understanding rather than just survival. 6 months after Sarah's first words in classical Kithan had shattered the diplomatic silence, their language rebuilding project had evolved into something approaching a cultural renaissance. The Meridian's communication arrays hummed constantly with transmissions from Kithan communities across the galaxy as survivors who had resigned themselves to cultural extinction suddenly found themselves part of a movement to recover their heritage. "We're receiving applications from 17 different refugee settlements," Sarah announced during their morning planning session, scrolling through requests for language education and cultural rebuilding assistance. "Apparently, word of our work has reached communities we didn't even know existed." Lyrith, who had become Sarah's co-director as the project expanded beyond simple academic research, studied the requests with growing excitement and concern. Some of these settlements have been isolated for over a century. They may have preserved language fragments that we haven't encountered yet. Their systematic approach to rebuilding had yielded remarkable results. Working with language archaeology techniques and contributions from dozens of elderly Kithan, they had successfully recovered approximately 70% of classical vocabulary and grammar structures. More importantly, they had trained a new generation of speakers who could think and communicate in ways their parents and grandparents had thought lost forever. But success brought complications that neither Sarah nor Lyrith had anticipated. Dr. Chen, Ambassador Torres said during their weekly project review, "We're receiving inquiries from the Altarian Republic, the Centauri Federation, and at least 6 other civilizations. They want to know if your rebuilding methods can be applied to their own endangered cultural traditions." Sarah paused in her analysis of newly received language data. "I suppose the techniques could be adapted, but each situation would require extensive individual research." "That's what they're hoping for," Torres replied. "The Galactic Cultural Council is discussing the establishment of a permanent institute for language preservation with you and Lyrith as founding directors." The prospect was both thrilling and overwhelming. Sarah's academic project had accidentally become a galactic movement for cultural preservation and recovery. But it also raised questions about resources, priorities, and the political implications of helping various species reconnect with heritage that contemporary governments might prefer to keep buried. Their work faced a different kind of challenge when factional disputes emerged within Kithan communities themselves. During a video conference with elders from the New Kepler settlement, Sarah witnessed firsthand the tensions that cultural rebuilding could create. Young Lyra speaks the old words beautifully, Elder Voren acknowledged, but she learned them from human archives rather than from proper cultural transmission. Can language recovered through academic research carry the same spiritual and cultural weight as knowledge passed down through generations? Lyritha's bioluminescent patterns flickered with controlled frustration. Elder Voren, with respect, the traditional cultural transmission was broken when our home world died. If we wait for proper methods, our language will disappear completely within 2 generations. Better to lose it entirely than to preserve a hollow approximation, Elder Voren replied firmly. Language without cultural context is just noise. Sarah found herself mediating between different philosophical approaches to cultural preservation, those who believed that any recovery was better than complete loss, and those who felt that artificially rebuilt traditions lacked the authenticity of organically preserved culture. The debate intensified when their project made its most significant discovery yet. Deep within the classical texts they had rebuilt, Sarah and Lyrith found detailed descriptions of the Vel sanctuary, an advanced ecological engineering technique that the ancient Kithon had used to create sustainable planetary environments. This isn't just historical curiosity, Sarah explained to the expanded research team they had assembled. The Vel Sanctuary protocols describe methods for atmospheric regulation, soil regeneration, and ecosystem balance that could address environmental crises on dozens of contemporary worlds. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, their newly assigned xenobiology specialist, studied the translated specifications with growing amazement. These techniques are centuries ahead of anything we currently use. If the translations are accurate, this knowledge could revolutionize terraforming and environmental restoration across the galaxy. But accessing the full technological specifications required fluency in classical Kithon that went beyond basic language rebuilding. The scientific concepts were embedded in cultural and philosophical frameworks that could only be understood by speakers who thought in the language rather than simply translating from it. We need native-level fluency in people who can bridge ancient knowledge with contemporary applications, Lyrith explained during a project meeting. And we need it quickly. 3 worlds in the Outer Rim are facing ecological collapse that these techniques might be able to prevent. Sarah realized they had reached a critical juncture. Their language archaeology had uncovered knowledge that could save lives and restore dying worlds. But accessing that knowledge required cultural immersion that went far beyond academic language learning. We need to create a new kind of educational program, Sarah decided. Intensive cultural and language immersion that doesn't just teach vocabulary and grammar, but helps people think in classical Kithon well enough to understand complex technical and philosophical concepts. Lyrith nodded, her patterns brightening with determination. A cultural academy. Somewhere that Kithon and interested members of other species can come to learn not just our language, but our ways of understanding reality. The proposal they submitted to the Galactic Cultural Council was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible, a permanent facility dedicated to intensive cultural and language education, staffed by the few remaining native speakers and the new generation of rebuilt fluency educators like Lyrith. But the environmental crisis facing multiple worlds provided compelling justification. When the Council learned that Kithon ecological engineering techniques might be able to save the dying ecosystem of Proxima 3, they approved funding for what would become the Institute for Cultural and Linguistic Preservation. Sarah, Lyrith said as they watched construction begin on the Institute's main facility, built in orbital space to accommodate students from multiple species and gravitational environments. Do you realize what we've accomplished? Sarah studied the architectural plans that incorporated design elements from dozens of different civilizations, creating a truly interspecies educational environment. We've created something that's never existed before, a place where endangered cultures can be not just preserved, but actively lived and taught. More than that, Lyrith replied, her voice filled with emotion. You've proved that loss doesn't have to be permanent. That with enough dedication and respect, even the most scattered and damaged cultures can be recovered and renewed. As the first group of students arrived at the Institute, Kidhan eager to reconnect with their heritage, humans fascinated by alternative ways of understanding reality, and representatives from other species facing their own cultural preservation challenges, Sarah realized that her spontaneous decision to speak classical Kidhan in a diplomatic meeting had triggered a revolution in how galactic civilization approached cultural diversity. They weren't just preserving the past anymore. They were creating new possibilities for the future, where the wisdom of ancient traditions could enhance rather than compete with contemporary progress. 2 years after the Institute's establishment, Sarah stood before the inaugural ceremony of New Kithra Station, the first permanent settlement designed specifically for Kidhan who wanted to live according to their rebuilt traditional values while maintaining connections to contemporary galactic civilization. The achievement represented everything their language preservation project had grown into, not just academic recovery of lost knowledge, but practical application of cultural wisdom to create new possibilities for living. Today marks the beginning of something unprecedented in galactic history. Sarah addressed the assembled crowd of humans, Kidhan, and representatives from dozens of other species who had supported the cultural rebuilding movement. We are witnessing the birth of the first post-diaspora Kidhan community, a society that honors ancient traditions while embracing contemporary innovations. From her position on the speaker's platform, Sarah could see Lyrith coordinating with the station's first residential families, her fluency in both classical and contemporary Kidhan allowing her to serve as a bridge between generations that had previously been separated by language barriers. The sight filled Sarah with profound satisfaction, knowing that their collaboration had made this moment possible. The New Kithra project had grown out of practical necessity when their institute's graduates began requesting permanent communities where they could raise children in bilingual environments, speaking both standard galactic and rebuilt classical Kidhan. The station's design incorporated advanced ecological engineering based on the recovered Vel sanctuary protocols, creating a sustainable habitat that served as both home and demonstration of ancient Kidhan environmental wisdom. Dr. Chen, Elder Kester said, approaching the platform after Sarah's address, "I need to thank you for something that goes beyond language recovery." Sarah smiled at the elderly Kidhan who had been one of their project's first contributors. Over the past 2 years, Elder Kester had become fluent in the classical tongue she had only remembered in fragments, allowing her to access cultural knowledge that she had carried but been unable to articulate. "You've given us back the ability to be ourselves without having to choose between honoring our ancestors and building futures for our children," Elder Kester continued. "My granddaughter will grow up speaking the language of our home world, but she'll also be a citizen of galactic civilization." The success of the Kidhan cultural rebuilding had indeed inspired similar projects across the galaxy. The Institute now housed departments dedicated to recovering endangered traditions from 17 different species, employing archaeological linguistics techniques that Sarah had developed and refined through trial and error. Status report from the Andorian Memory Song Rebuilding Project, announced Dr. Kenji Sato, who had become the Institute's Director of Comparative Cultural Archaeology. "We've successfully recovered 60% of their pre-colonial musical traditions, and 3 settlements have requested resident ethnomusicologists to teach traditional compositions to younger generations." Sarah reviewed the reports with satisfaction tinged by concern about their expanding responsibilities. What had begun as a personal academic project had become a galactic institution with implications that reached far beyond simple cultural preservation. "Lyrith," she said during their evening planning session, "are you comfortable with how far this has grown? Sometimes I worry that we've created something bigger than either of us can properly manage." Lyrith, now fluent enough in classical Kidhan to think in the language rather than translating from standard galactic, smiled with the distinctive bioluminescent patterns that Sarah had learned to recognize as deep contentment. "Sarah, do you remember what you asked me during our first conversation about this project? Whether it was better to let old languages rest with lost homeworlds?" Sarah nodded, recalling her younger colleague's initial resignation about cultural recovery. I think we've answered that question definitively, Lyrith continued. Not only is it possible to recover what seemed permanently lost, but doing so creates new opportunities that benefit everyone, not just the cultures being preserved. The evidence supported her assessment. The ecological engineering techniques recovered from classical Kithan texts had been successfully applied to environmental restoration projects on 12 different worlds. The philosophical frameworks embedded in their rebuilt language had inspired new approaches to interspecies diplomacy and conflict resolution. Even their language. Rebuilding methodologies were being adapted by other species to recover their own endangered cultural traditions. But perhaps the most significant transformation was personal. Sarah watched Lyrith move through New Kithra Station with confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was, not just a refugee seeking integration with alien societies, but a keeper of ancient wisdom and contemporary innovation, equally comfortable with classical cultural traditions and cutting-edge galactic technology. There's something I need to tell you, Lyrith said as they toured the station's Cultural Education Center, where children were learning traditional Kithan art forms that incorporated both recovered techniques and contemporary materials. The Kithan Council of Elders has offered me the position of Cultural Ambassador to the Galactic Federation. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and anticipated loss. That's extraordinary recognition. You've earned it. I want you to know that I'm only considering the position because of what we've built together, Lyrith continued. The Institute, New Kithra, the cultural rebuilding movement, all of it grew from your willingness to see value in preserving what others had written off as extinct. Sarah realized that their partnership had created something neither of them could have achieved alone. Her language expertise had provided the technical foundation for cultural recovery, while Lyrith's cultural insight and emotional connection to the material had guided the rebuilding toward practical applications that served contemporary needs. If you accept the ambassador position, Sarah said, I want to propose something that might sound ambitious even by our standards. Lyrith's bioluminescent patterns brightened with curiosity. More ambitious than creating the first post-diaspora alien settlement? A permanent cultural exchange corps, Sarah explained, her vision crystallizing as she spoke. Teams of cultural archaeologists, language specialists, and community organizers who can work with any species facing heritage loss or cultural disruption. A galactic institution dedicated to proving that diversity strengthens rather than threatens civilization. The proposal represented everything their work had taught them about the relationship between cultural preservation and social progress. Rather than seeing tradition and innovation as competing forces, they had learned to combine them in ways that enhanced both individual identity and collective capability. Sarachan, Lyrith said formally, using the ceremonial tone she had learned from classical Kithan diplomatic traditions, I accept your proposal and offer my partnership in this endeavor. Together, we will help ensure that no culture need be lost simply because it has been scattered or displaced. As they finalized plans for the Cultural Exchange Corps, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with her spontaneous decision to speak a few phrases of rebuilt ancient language. That moment of academic curiosity had grown into a galactic movement that was reshaping how civilizations approached cultural diversity, heritage preservation, and the relationship between past wisdom and future innovation. Lyrith, Sarah said as they watched the first group of New Kithra children playing games that seamlessly blended ancient cultural traditions with contemporary technology, I have a confession to make. What kind of confession? Lyrith asked with amusement. When I first spoke to you in classical Kithan, I was terrified I'd gotten the pronunciation completely wrong. I had spent weeks practicing those phrases, but I'd never heard them spoken by a native speaker. Lyrith's laughter carried the musical quality that Sarah had learned was characteristic of emotional expression in the classical tongue. Sarah, none of us were native speakers anymore. You became fluent in my ancestral language before I did. But you carried it in your memory, Sarah pointed out. The knowledge was there, waiting to be awakened. I just provided the key. Their conversation was interrupted by an incoming transmission from the Galactic Cultural Council. The message contained official authorization for the Cultural Exchange Corps, along with funding that would allow them to expand their work to species across multiple galaxies. Dr. Chen, Cultural Ambassador Lyrith, the transmission began. The Council has reviewed your proposal and is prepared to establish the Cultural Exchange Corps as a permanent galactic institution. Your work with Kidhan language rebuilding has demonstrated the practical value of cultural preservation in ways that benefit all civilizations. As they reviewed the authorization documents, Sarah realized they were looking at the foundation for something that could reshape how different species related to each other across the galaxy. Instead of seeing cultural differences as obstacles to overcome, civilizations could learn to view them as resources to be preserved and shared. Our first assignment, Lyrith noted, reading through the mission parameters, is with the Etherian Collective. They're facing complete cultural dissolution as their homeworld undergoes ecological collapse, and they've requested assistance with preserving their artistic and philosophical traditions. Sarah nodded, already mentally preparing for the challenges of working with a species whose cultural expressions existed primarily in forms of energy manipulation rather than language communication. Different methods, same principles. Every culture contains wisdom that took thousands of years to develop, wisdom that benefits everyone when it's preserved and understood. As they prepared to embark on their next cultural rebuilding mission, Sarah reflected on how completely her understanding of her own profession had evolved. What had begun as academic linguistics had become something more like cultural medicine, healing the wounds that displacement, conquest, and forced assimilation had inflicted on civilizations across the galaxy. Sarah, Lyrith said as they boarded the transport that would take them to their new assignment, "There's something else I need to tell you. The children here on New Kithra, they're going to grow up truly bilingual in ways that haven't existed for centuries. They'll think in classical Kidhan and contemporary standard, accessing concepts and insights from both traditions. Which means they'll be capable of innovations that neither culture could achieve alone," Sarah realized. Exactly. We haven't just preserved the past, we've created new possibilities for the future. Looking back at New Kithra Station as their transport departed, Sarah saw families who represented something unprecedented in galactic history, people who had reclaimed their heritage without sacrificing their place in contemporary civilization, who had proven that cultural preservation and progress could enhance rather than compete with each other. Their work had demonstrated that language was more than just communication. It was a repository of ways of thinking, understanding, and relating to existence that enriched the entire galaxy when preserved and shared. And perhaps most importantly, they had shown that loss didn't have to be permanent, that with sufficient dedication and respect, even the most scattered and damaged cultures could be recovered and renewed. As they traveled toward their next mission, Sarah and Lyrith began planning how to adapt their language archaeology techniques to energy-based cultural expressions. The challenge would be different, but the principle remained the same. Every civilization contained unique wisdom that deserved preservation, and that preservation could benefit all species willing to invest in understanding rather than just survival. "Thank you," Lyrith said quietly as they reviewed mission parameters for the Etherian assignment. "For what this time?" Sarah asked with a smile. "For hearing something in my voice that I didn't even know was there, for recognizing that my people's heritage was worth recovering, even when we had almost given up on it ourselves." Sarah squeezed her friend's hand, marveling at how a moment of academic curiosity had grown into a galactic movement that was reshaping how civilizations understood the relationship between diversity and strength. "Thank you for trusting me with your culture's most precious treasures," Sarah replied, "and for teaching me that the most important discoveries aren't about understanding the past, they're about creating better possibilities for the future." As their transport jumped to hyperspace, carrying them toward their next cultural rebuilding mission, both women understood that their work had become more than professional collaboration. They had become partners in proving that the galaxy's greatest strength lay not in uniformity, but in the preservation and celebration of the countless different ways that consciousness could understand existence, express meaning, and create beauty from the raw materials of reality itself.